Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for this episode. Our guest today is Dr. Dawn Marie Turner. She's an OCM specialist, a keynote speaker, and author. Her most recent book is Launch, Lead, Live, the Executive Guide to Preventing Resistance and Succeeding with Organizational Change. So Dawn, thank you so much for carving time out your schedule to have this conversation.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So Dawn, let's start the conversation with just learning more about your background.
Okay. Well, I'm a rather unique. I came about to organizational change kind of through a circuitous route. I started my career actually in nursing and healthcare and primarily public health. So that's focused on health promotion, health education, and really preventing disease and disability. Ran an adolescent health education center for a number of years, which really then inspired me to look at how do we adopt behaviors? What do we need to do to change behaviors, make choices, and how it influences our choices?
Yeah.
It was really instrumental in me discovering that knowledge and act doesn't equal action. We can know lots of things, but take completely different action. Went back to school, finished a master's degree in education, went back into the field of health promotion and behavioral change related to promoting health and lifestyle. Got hired by a large multinational IT company for my behavioral change background. Actually ended up working a year as one of their security analysts, which was a completely different path, lots of fun. But as I got involved in their organizational change practice, could see large gaps in the way that organizations were approaching change. At that time, the theories of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross were big into the change community. And then began to blend my experience with helping people adopt healthier behaviors and choices and change into the organization to, in the end, create healthier, stronger organizations because of change, and not simply organizations that survive in spite of it.
Yeah.
They managed to muddle along. So that's how I came about it. Went back to school, did a PhD in leadership and decision science,
Awesome.
did my thesis on change readiness, and really then that, as they say, the rest was history, history.
Yeah. Awesome. So we're talking about the new language of change management, which is awesome. You know, it's 2020. I think it's time for a lot of people who work and do, work on large scale transformations to start rethinking the way they go about the work. So this is a very beneficial conversation. So my question to you, what's the core problem with the traditional way of how we think about change management?
Well, I think it's not so much the traditional way we think about change management. I mean, it depends what we're talking about. There's the approach that we take to change management.
Yep.
That is the typical way that's done, which is really grounded in that project management philosophy and comes from, not surprising, it comes from those roots, so very project-based. So there are advantages to that, but there are core disadvantages for using that approach, although it's the most popular. And then there's the language and the approach generally that we come to in our belief system about change and people's interaction with change. And so they're two separate things. So I can talk first a little bit about some of the disadvantages of the kind of typical project, what I call a project-centric approach. And then I'll talk a little bit about how our beliefs drive that approach. That's okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the project, well, I call it a project-centric approach. And that really, I heard a number of years ago, people talk about the people side of project management. And that's certainly better than nothing because it provides discipline, it provides some structure, and there's a recognition that people need support to go through change. We need, it's a process, right? The key, some of the core disadvantages to that approach are that it doesn't create enough ownership. I'm the project team, you are not on the project team. I feel an ownership towards whatever that new desire is, but you may not.
Yeah.
And hence that influences the way you interact with the change. It doesn't often allow enough time for the full scope of the change to occur, because typically the timeline in a project-based change is based on the project management timeline or the project timeline. And as
Yep.
we know, change takes much longer than a typical project might take. And the other thing is that some of the core elements of active involvement and decision making are relegated to a small group of people versus the people that need to do the heavy lifting, make a change,
Yeah.
are not enough actively involved. So that's part of the problem with a project-centric approach. Now, having said that, there's a place for that, and there's value in that, in using good project management practices when you have a project and you're using a project to influence change.
Yep.
The other challenge with that, though, is there are so many changes that go on in your organizations that never hit the radar of a project.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens is all of those essential elements, the key pieces that allow people to embrace change, don't get addressed.
Yeah.
They're ignored, right? So that's the problem with the project-centric approach, as I see it. The other is our belief system, and there's a fundamental belief in most of the literature that you read,
Yeah.
in most of the books that you get, is we have to manage resistance to change. And that's based on a belief that people resist change. And I advocate that we don't, that's not true. If we actually resisted change, we wouldn't be where we are right now in 2020. Think about the number of changes we've adopted in just the last 3 years in our own lives.
In our own lives. Yeah.
So the shift in language that we need is to start talking about how do we prepare and build readiness for change versus how do we manage the resistance to change. And why that's helpful in my thinking and a better approach is because it's more affirmative. It acknowledges a willingness of people to move forward, and it reduces the defensive threat response in my brain as the leader, assuming that you're going to be resistant, and it minimizes the chance for a threat response to you.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because I was doing some research and I was thinking about where did this resistance, narrative come from? And it's been around for decades. I was Googling some things and there's, academic articles that range back to like 1948, the 50s, the 60s, and right when, and, you have the Industrial Revolution and they're assessing how can you make work, they're thinking about how can we make work more human, because everything was industrial factories and things of that nature. But that was the narrative. It was all about assuming that people resist change. And then to your point, if you look at some of the definitions from back in the day, it's defining resistance as a behavior which is intended to protect someone from the effects of change, right? So it's like the person is assuming that they have to protect themselves. And here we are in 2020 where the workplace environment has overall is way more friendly, in a lot of places than it would be if, let's say, if it was like in the late 50s or 60s or 70s. So I think what you're advocating for is perfect, and preparing the workforce, thinking about it from a readiness perspective versus resistance. I love that. So how do you define readiness or people
So People readiness, I define people readiness as a person's willingness and ability and belief in their ability to engage and commit to taking the actions necessary to reach a new place, to
Hmm.
do so, to willingness and an ability to adopt and engage in the behaviors, the activities, the mindset that's required to adopt new behaviors, new activities related to a change.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love
Yeah.
that. 'Cause if you think
And the
about
key
if
in that is their willingness, right? It's all about
Mhm.
our willingness. Change is a choice. You know, I get asked from leaders like, well, what do you do when change is mandated? We can't mandate someone else to make a change. You can get anybody to do anything for a short period of time under duress, under the threat of losing their job. But as soon as you take that pressure off, what we know from the neuroscience now is two things happen. One, the learning isn't retained. It's only in short-term memory. It's only there because of the duress. So you lose the learning that's occurred. And two, they'll go back to exactly what they were before. And now you've raised a level of discontent, disengagement, and cynicism related to the change.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. So, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and we have a few people on the line, and more will probably join. Can you walk us through your exercise the tactics that you use to help stakeholders kind of reframe the situation from resistance to readiness?
Sure. So let's, what I'll ask people to do is just think for a moment at a time when you quote unquote resisted a change, an organizational change that your organization was going through.
Hmm.
And just get it in your head for a minute of what that felt like. And then take a pen and write down 3 reasons why you resisted that change. And I'll just give you a minute to write 3 reasons down.
Yeah, I'm actually doing exercise right now.
Okay, great. And then beside those 3 reasons, write down 3 behaviors or actions that you took as a result of those reasons in terms of you resisting change.
Hmm.
And if you don't have 3, write 1 or 2. But
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
so I'm curious, what did you come up with? What were your reasons for
Yeah.
resisting change?
So I was recalling a time when, for me, I was recalling a time when I'm working for an organization and there was an IT upgrade, right? Like a Windows upgrade, Microsoft Office upgrade, and I was resistant to it because IT doesn't. I at the time IT didn't have a positive reputation for doing successful upgrades, right? So you start to upgrade your computer, and then all of a sudden your computer, the upgrade is not successful. I may lose my files, right? I may lose my email. All of a sudden, I can't maintain my calendar. And so, as an employee, I was resistant because I didn't comply. I waited to the very, very last minute because I was worried that I was worried I couldn't trust the system. Put it like that. So I didn't upload the new software.
Right. So a lack of trust.
Lack of.
Sounded like there was a lack of communication. There wasn't a clear understanding of what was put in place. Even if there was something put in place, you didn't know what was put in place to protect your files,
Exactly.
and that past history of maybe failed ITs where
Hmm.
you had lost stuff.
Hmm.
So a fear of loss, maybe you're up also against critical deadlines. So
Yep.
when you look at that list, and this is what I get leaders to do when I'm working with them individually or in my courses, when you look at that list, what's significant about that list is everything was within the control and the ability of the IT department or whoever was leading that initiative to do something about. It wasn't a psychological state that you had,
Mm.
it was a symptom And that's what I call resistance. It's a symptom of an unresolved situation or event manifested in actions and behaviors. It's all within the control of the leader. So
Hmm.
if we start letting go of that, and instead of saying, and this is the strategy that I teach to all of my leaders, the number one strategy to start with to shift the mindset is I ask them to let go of the language of resistance. So whenever they're going to hear themselves say about somebody, because that's the other thing resistance often is, it's a label that we apply
It
to
is
someone
called.
who isn't jumping up and down and enthusiastic about the change as we are. When they're about to say he, she, they are resistant to change, shift their language to say he, she, they are not prepared and ready yet. And
Mhm.
follow that up with the question, what will they need to feel prepared and ready to move with me on this journey? And once you do that, not only do you open up your own thinking, but you approach the individuals that you're going to introduce the change to very differently.
Mhm.
Because if I engage in a conversation believing that you are resistant to change, then every question, everything that doesn't feel like it's in agreement poses a threat and puts me in a defensive position.
Yeah.
Every time I go back and try and push harder to
Yeah.
sell you on this change puts you into a defensive position. But by shifting our language, what I now do is I take your question and I hear it from oh, this is my opportunity to help you prepare. And I see it as, what a great question. I probably had the same question when 6 months, 8 months, a month ago, I thought about initiating this change for our department or our team or our organization.
I love it because you're talking about, just being mindful. I heard some elements of, growth mindset. You mentioned the whole not yet, right? But I like that exercise because if you can help someone else recall a moment where they were resistant to change, and get them to think about, okay, what conditions would need to be in place for, what conditions would need to be in place for you to be comfortable with the change that you went through in your past. Now you're getting them to do some self-reflection. You're calling out things like trust, better communication. So now they can think about, okay, well, how can we apply some of those elements to this new initiative that we're about to face now? So I like that, especially from a leadership development standpoint, because a lot of our work can be accelerated with the right mindset. So I
I
like.
agree completely. Yeah. And so it's all about first starting with a shift in language. If we can stop labeling people and going into change situations as, well, they're resistant and we're just going to have to push this through, versus this is the first time they're hearing about this.
Mm-hmm.
A huge sense of loss, like you
Mm-hmm.
talked about. Can
Yeah.
you imagine the situation in your upgrade if the IT department had come and said, look, we're going to do this IT, the night before we've done a full backup,
Mm-hmm.
1 hour before we launch, we're going to do another preemptive backup just in case. So we expect to be down for this amount of time, should be give or take, that you'd been understood why the upgrade was needed.
Yeah.
It would have been a completely different situation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love it. So what are some common mistakes to avoid? We're talking about helping organizations, helping teams, helping leaders really reframe, moving from resistance to readiness. And doing that, even leveraging the exercise that you're sharing with us, what are some common mistakes that we need to avoid?
Well, I think first is language. So as I work with my clients and in my courses, I talk about letting go of the resistance language. So what we talked about, each time you're about to say he, she, they are resistant, to shift it to, preparation and readiness. I think that's the first key. I think the other mistake is the belief that um, we don't have time to involve everyone, and this idea that involvement is somehow optional for employees moving through change, and it's not. It's necessary. It change can't happen. They are already by default involved.
Hmm.
So creating again, that goes back to that project centric approach. You've got this small project team trying to move and push this change out to everyone. Look for a structure that allows for active involvement, that channels what they're naturally involved in. Because if you're going to upload that IT
Hmm.
and use the IT that you're going to get the value as intended, you're going to have to change behaviors and things like that. So I think involvement is another key area that we often mistakenly think we don't have time to do that. So
Yeah.
I think that's another one. And the other big one, and again it goes through this resistance versus readiness, is there's far too much passive communication. You can't do change by email.
Hmm.
We need to engage people in conversations, and the research is pretty clear, the evidence is pretty clear on those leaders that actively engage conversation and storytelling to build that readiness. They're moving change through their organization with as minimal amount of discomfort as is possible given the level of change that's required.
Yeah, no, Don, I love that. I love that. And it flows right with some of the other conversations that I've been having with other people within the community. So I love that. So everyone, Don's most recent book is Launch, Lead, Live. You can find it on Amazon. It's the executive guide to preventing resistance and succeeding with organizational change. So if you don't have it, go to Amazon.com and check it out. Don, you have your own community, right? And website. Can you share that with the community?
Yes, we have our Think Transition community. So if anybody would like to join, please just go to our website. It's thinktransition.com. And we offer resources or articles, information on our upcoming courses, and everyone's welcome to join. We'd be pleased to have you. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Don, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me, Brian. Take care.
All right.
Bye
Take care.
now.